All right, guys, welcome back to our MDC Criminal Law class, where today I'm going to be covering Chapter 9 from the textbook titled Crimes Against the Government and Terrorism. This seems like a pretty short chapter, so it's not something that I think will be a long lecture. Let's get straight to it. We've talked about crimes against the person. We've talked about crimes against property. Last chapter, we covered crimes against public order and crimes against the public decency. In this chapter, we're going to go ahead and cover crimes against the government. And there are quite a few of them. The first one that we're going to get to is public corruption, where there isn't really a definition for it from the textbook. But the FBI in 2010 actually announced that public corruption was the #1 crime that it was prioritizing, which is interesting. It had been for a while terrorism, and it shifted its focus and resources to fighting public corruption. The FBI in 2015 stated that, quote, public corruption poses a fundamental threat to our national security and way of life. It impacts everything from how well our borders are secured and our neighborhoods are protected, to verdicts handed down in courts, to the quality of our roads, schools, and other government services. And it takes a significant toll on our pocketbooks, wasting billions in tax dollars every year. Now, issues with corruption are important. Public corruption is a real issue in the sense that the public's well-being and safety may be at risk. For example, if a building inspector is bribed to ignore a faulty wire, this could lead potentially to an electrical fire, which could result not just in the deaths of many people, but also in the destruction of property, which could cost insurance companies and private individuals a lot of money. And so, corruption is one of the themes of this chapter. We're going to discuss corruption within the context of bribery, official misconduct in office. So those two really are probably the bigger or well-known or better known public corruption crimes. The first real definition that I'm going to give you today, though, is perjury. Okay. Now, perjury are false statements willfully made under oath in a judicial proceeding. Now, students ask me all the time, how serious is perjury? Well, in the common law, perjury was punishable by death. So, historically, perjury has been a significant crime for society or within society. But again, this is defined historically as false statements that are willfully made, intentionally made under oath in a judicial proceeding. Okay. So lying under oath when you are testifying in a court proceeding is perjury. But also, if you're giving a deposition, depositions are not handled in court, but they still have the same importance or the same honor code system, because you are going to be giving statements before a court reporter and before ideally both parties in a trial outside of that courtroom under oath. And if you lie under these official proceedings, you have also committed the crime of perjury. All right. Assuming that you were under oath. I should clarify that. Assuming that you were under oath. Now, a crime related to perjury is subornation of perjury. Subornation of perjury is also a common law crime that involved convincing another person or obtaining another to commit perjury. All right, so let me make sure I give you the correct textbook definition from the end of the book. but it is defined as the offense of procuring someone to commit perjury. In other words, convincing another person to commit perjury. Okay. Now, in Florida, perjury is punishable by, it's considered a third-degree felony, which means that you could get punished by up to 5 years in prison. Now, if you're wondering if that's something to laugh at, well, 5 years in prison is a long time, right? If you live to be 100, and very few people live to live 100, that's 5% of your life in prison. So perjury remains a very serious crime. And one of the ones that you most need to focus on. Now, false swearing is related to perjury, but these are false statements that you give that would have been perjury except for the fact that they were not made in judicial proceedings. So these are lies that you make that would have been perjury except for the fact that you didn't make them in official judicial proceedings. And so therefore, we don't call these perjury. Okay. Now, bribery, next crime we're going to cover. Bribery is defined as when a person offers, gives, receives, or solicits anything of value to influence action by public or sometimes even non-public officials. Okay, so to summarize, to say it again, the offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting of anything of value to influence action by public officials, in some instances, non-public officials. Okay. Now, bribery is punishable or punishes not just the person who receives the bribe, but also the giver of the bribe. All right. And it's something that happens a lot throughout the world. It's not by comparison as big of an issue in the United States, although it remains an issue in the United States. And that is the crime of bribery. A separate crime, a third crime that we're going to cover, is called official misconduct in office. And this is defined as any willful, unlawful behavior by public officials in the course of their official duties. Now, this may be subdivided into three different types. So official misconduct may be divided into three different types. The first one is a failure to act when you should have acted. We call this nonfeasance. A second subcategory of official misconduct in office is called malfeasance, which is engaging in a wrongful act that the official does not have the right to do. And a third category of official misconduct in office is called misfeasance, which is improperly performing an act that the official had the right to do. All right. So a failure to act, we call that nonfeasance. The wrongful act that a public official did not have the right to do, we call malfeasance. And improperly performing an act that an official had the right to do, we call misfeasance. And all three of these are categorized within the broader umbrella of official misconduct in office. Okay. Now, the textbook mentions also obstruction of justice. Now, obstruction of justice, for whatever reason, is not defined. Oh, it is defined. Interesting. I thought it wasn't defined. It is defined. So let's define it. Interference with the orderly processes of civil and criminal courts, such as refusing to produce evidence, intimidating witnesses, and bribing judges. Okay. So if you destroy evidence in anticipation of a trial that you're going to get sued, that's called obstruction of justice, and that is a crime. If you try to intimidate a jury or bribe a jury to produce a specific verdict, That is also called obstruction of justice. If you try to bribe the judge, we call that also obstruction of justice. Okay. Now, another crime, a fifth crime that we're going to cover, is called contempt of court. And this is a big, this happens a lot to lawyers and even witnesses and parties to a trial. Now, contempt refers to willfully disregarding or disobeying a public official's orders. Okay. Now, typically, contempt is mentioned within the process of courtroom proceedings. So you're usually hear contempt in the context of what's called contempt of court. And again, contempt defined as willfully disregarding or disobeying a public official's orders. Now, the punishment for this, courts may choose to give you a civil fine or even potentially punish you with jail sentences, brief jail sentences. Okay. So typically when we think of contempt, we're thinking of contempt of court. The state of Florida, for example, defines contempt as, quote, a refusal to obey any legal order, mandate, or decree made or given by any judge relative to any of the business of said court after due notice thereof. So the court has told you to do something, the judge has told you to do something, and you have chosen to willfully disregard what the judge told you. Now you are found in contempt of court. You may also be found in contempt of Congress, which is, for example, when you refuse to testify when Congress has ordered you to do so. Okay, and that's a separate. That's also falls within contempt. It's just called contempt of Congress. The most common contempt we're going to consider is contempt of court. All right. Treason, separate crime. Treason is defined as attempting to overthrow the government of which one is a citizen or betraying that government to a foreign power. Now, treason has been considered as a serious offense, and it's actually mentioned in Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which states, quote, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Now, Congress has the power to legislate and to define and legislate the punishment for treason. All right. Within the United States, we have had less than 50 cases officially prosecuted of treason, even though other treasonous acts have been prosecuted under other statutes that are not treason. Espionage is related to treason, and this is called, this is basically spying, which is defined in the federal statutes as gathering, transmitting, or losing national defense information with the intent or reasonable belief that the information will be used against the United States. And that's considered espionage. All right. A related crime to treason is called misprision of treason, which is defined as the concealment of the known treason of another. And lastly, another crime very much related to treason is called sedition, which is a communication or agreement aimed at stirring up treason or defaming the government. Okay. So that's it for sedition. That's it for treason. That's it for espionage. Make sure you guys keep those definitions in mind, especially as we get closer and closer to our final exam. Terrorism. The last crime that we're really going to cover today in this chapter. Well, terrorism and cyber terrorism. Terrorism is defined by the textbook as violent acts or threats of violence to create fear, alarm, dread, or coercion, usually against governments. So again, terrorism is defined as violent acts or threats of violence to create fear, alarm, dread, or coercion, usually against governments. Now, Terrorism may be domestic, it may be foreign. The textbook mentions a bunch of different examples. The Boston Marathon bombing, which happened a few years ago, is an example, a very well-known example. Terrorist attacks on Paris on November 13th, 2015, which killed 130. Obviously, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, what he did is considered acts of terrorism. The Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh in 1995 is another example of terrorism, right? So these are all prohibited by state and federal statutes. Obviously, terrorism gained a much higher prominence in the aftermath of 9/11, but even before that, the Twin Trade Towers have been hit by Osama bin Laden in 1993. There had been other embassy attacks that had also occurred throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s. All of these are considered acts of terrorism. Cyber terrorism is the use of internet for terrorist threats. So here is where you are dealing with the dissemination, for example, of viruses, or trying to even destroy an entire infrastructure information. So it's not necessarily something that's going to result in immediate injury, property destruction, or death, but it does involve methods of mass destruction that can be extremely harmful and have very long-term ramifications. So cyber terrorism examples covered by the book are listed here. For example, providing information on how to build bombs and other destructive devices online, or information on how to infiltrate or destroy communication networks, posting terrorist propaganda urging action, to computer viruses, logic bombs that are set to detonate at a certain time and destroy or rewrite data, high energy radio frequency guns that disable electronic targets through high powered radio signals. All of these are examples of cyber terrorism. All right. And that's it for this chapter. Like I promised you guys, it's a short chapter. See you guys next week. Stay safe, everybody. Bye, guys.